Sigma, Sigma, Sigma. This is a surprise release for me because going back to 2013, Sigma released the 18 to 35 DG HSM, something like that. It was an APS-C F1.8 zoom lens, and at that time it was the only one available. And I remember because that was just right around the time where I was starting this YouTube channel or really trying to push this growth. And every single tech reviewer that I watched was oozing about that 18 to 35. So you could say for the last 11 years, people have been waiting for the successor to that lens. And we have it today in the form of this 28 to 45 f1.8 DGDN. Now this is a full frame f1.8 zoom lens, and it is the spiritual successor to that 18 to 35 that so many people loved. And in this video, I'm going to check it out, so let's begin. This new art lens comes in a large white box with manuals, a strap, zippered pouch, lens hood, and lens caps. This lens is not compact, it's large, even compared to a decently sized Tamron 28 to 75mm G2. And it feels heavy, just over 2 pounds, 950 grams on my scale. That being said, it feels just as well built and solid and premium as the 24 to 70 Mark II. The other thing I noticed is that it does have a floating element inside, so it does make a little noise as you move the lens around. But this is par for the course, as most lenses with linear motors are this way nowadays. Starting at the rear, there is a metal mount, electronics, and a rubber gasket. This lens is dust and splash resistant. 024 indicates this is a 2024 release. Minimum focus is 0.3 meters or 1 foot and made in Japan. The aperture ring is identical to what you get on any other modern art lens, clicky or declicked. It's very well done with tight tolerances. Up on top, there is a Sigma logo, lens specs, autofocus manual focus switch, a click switch, and another switch to lock you into or out of auto aperture. Zoom ring is up next, and it's as good as it gets. Smooth, good resistance, good grip, well damped, and all of the zooming is done internally, so the lens stays this same size through the zoom range. In front of that, there are 2 customizable buttons, an A Art Series logo. There is a manual focus ring here as well, which is buttery smooth, nice and grippy, but it's all electronic, so it spins forever in either direction. Finally, around the front, there is a nice size front lens element in true art fashion. No lens specs or writing or logos here. It's nice and clean. Inside, this lens has 18 elements in 15 groups, an 11 rounded blade diaphragm, and Sigma's HLA linear autofocus motor, making everything work together. Here it is paired with an A7C, and it is a lens that does dwarf the camera body, doesn't it? The body is an accessory to the lens, not the other way around. Anyway, apart from the large size, it is an attractive looking lens. Sigma is doing a great job with lens design in my opinion. Now, before I show you what this lens is capable of, there are a couple of things that I want to mention. This is an f1.8 zoom, and there are not that many f1.8 zoom lenses out on the market because it's a challenging task. I don't really know of any of them besides that 18 to 35, which Sigma came out with 11 years ago. What you have here is a zoom lens that is really a bunch of prime lenses inside of a zoom lens body. And in fact, Sigma busted out some MTF charts which show that this 28 to 45 is sharper than their own 24mm art and 50mm art lenses. And it takes a big company with big bouquet balls to come out and say that. So I respect that. So here are some samples taken with my Sony A7C. All of these are straight out of the camera, no picture profiles, no edits, nothing crazy, nothing fancy. This is what you can expect with this lens and a 4-year-old Sony camera body. Ready, set, go. Alright, so this lens is a solid performer. It does have a few small issues, but it's a marvel of engineering. Let's talk about sharpness first. This lens is exceptionally sharp in the center, in the corners, really everywhere. Here it is compared to the Tamron 28-75 G2 at 35mm, and at f2.8 it is sharper in the center and quite a bit sharper in the corners. Even wide open at f1.8, impressively this art is sharper in both the center and the corners than the Tamron is at f2.8. Colors and contrast levels are excellent, the images are punchy, dynamic, and it's really what I've come to expect from Sigma lenses. Distortions are also well controlled. There is a tiny bit of barrel distortion on the wide end, slight waviness at about 35mm, and the image is pretty flat at 45mm. Vignetting is a non-issue. Chromatic aberration is very well controlled. There is surprisingly little of it seen wide open in bright, high contrast shots. Even when you try to push it, it does a good job of keeping fringing under control. Along with this, flare performance was good with a very small effect on contrast levels and no crazy flares or anything to take over your image. I even found ghosting to be impressively well controlled as well, whether in the day or at night. The bokeh is very smooth, circular. At the edges it seems to turn into ovals instead of cat eyes, which is pretty cool. There's a lot to like from the optics on this 28-45. And really this lens shines at night where it gathers a ton of light. If this is what your eye sees, this lens can gather about this much light. And for a zoom lens, this is not something that I'm used to. Autofocus performance is solid. I found tracking to be accurate and quick. The linear motor was silent and never seemed to hunt. And even with that super shallow depth of field at 45mm, I had almost no misfocused photos. Alright, so there are a lot of positives here, but what are the negatives? Well, first, I've already mentioned the size and the weight. Now, this may be more convenient than swapping, let's say, 3 different primes from your camera bag, but this is probably going to weigh about equivalent to having 3 separate primes packed away in your bag, and there's really nothing inconspicuous about whipping this massive lens out if you're trying to be incognito out and do street photography. Then let's talk about the zoom range. I think that a lot of people will wish that this was something like a 24-50mm. When I reviewed the recently released Sony 24-50, I mentioned how even at 24mm that lens isn't wide enough for a lot of work nowadays with stabilization crops. Even if this lens was a 24mm on the wide end, people would want it to be a 20mm. It's just one of those things. But the reason I bring this up is because I'm trying to figure out which primes this lens would replace. Yes, it could replace the Sony 28mm f2, for example, and the 35mm f1.8, and then maybe a 40mm. The 45mm really isn't a typical focal length, and this lens doesn't reach 50mm. Really, this entire range is a bit narrow, but if this is how big this lens is, I can only imagine how much larger a 20-50mm version would have been. Then I have to mention the focus breathing, which isn't excessive, but on the wider end there is some movement, more so than with many of Sigma's newer lenses, some of which have no focus breathing at all through the range by some miracle. And that's not to say that the focus breathing is horrible, but I was just expecting it to perform similar to, let's say, the 24-70 version 2, and it just didn't. It was just slightly worse, which may or may not be an issue depending on how you use this lens. Now, if you take a look at this lens as a, let's say, a wedding lens or a walk around hobbyist lens, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But if you look at this lens the way it's supposed to be looked at, which is as a production lens or a video production lens, then it kind of does make sense. And Sigma spent a lot of time in their reading materials about this lens talking about making this specifically for video production and for people who would use this in studios, for YouTube channels, for whatever it is. And the minimum focus being as close as it is, it would be great for macro-like product shots, so that makes a whole lot of sense. And because of the size and the weight, if you're keeping it in a studio on a tripod, on a rig, then it wouldn't be much of an issue anyway. And the key here is the difference between f1.8 and f2.8. There are plenty of f2.8 zooms out there that offer way better ranges that are significantly smaller and still sharp. But there's only one f1.8 zoom that I know of, and f1.8 is 1 1/3 stops brighter than f2.8. That means that a shot at f1.8 will only take 40% of the exposure time of a shot at f2.8 if you you keep all other settings the same. So you get much better light gathering, more bokeh, and shallower depth of field. All of this does come at a price, however, and for this lens, that price is $1,349 US. And look, that is expensive, but for a lens that has no other competition, I also see that as a bit of a bargain. If Sony had made this lens, they would be charging over $3,000 for it. You and I both know it. So that is my review of this 28 to 45mm f1.8 zoom art lens. It's another brilliant lens from Sigma and really kind of a show-off piece of what they can achieve with all of their resources and brilliant minds over there in Japan. And I think it's going to be a very popular, if not slightly controversial lens. I don't plan on adding it to my own personal collection, but if you are looking for something like this and you want to add it to your own, then please use the link down in the description to check out, read more about it, check out pricing, pre-order. This thing launches at the end of the month, so around the 20th of June, 2024. So it's very exciting, and we'll see what they come up with next. Special thank you to Sigma for sending this lens out for review, and a bigger thank you to you guys for watching these videos and supporting this channel. Thank you so much. Stay tuned for more. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.